Great, so let's get started. Hello and welcome to this event on eradicating the disadvantage gap. What should labor invest? Where should labor invest? So thank you very much for joining us here in Liverpool, and thanks to those of you also joining online. So this event is organized by Nesta, the UK's innovation agency for social good, and I'm delighted to be chairing it. I am Sarah Catton, Director of Nesta's Fair Start mission, whose objective is to close the disadvantage gap in school readiness by 2030. So as I'm sure a lot of you know, by the time children enter school, children who qualify for free school meals are 30% less likely than their more affluent peers to reach a good level of development. And these gaps are visible well before the age of 5, and they also play a big part in driving inequalities in further educational achievements and later adult social and economic outcomes. So in their manifesto, the Labour Party has committed to breaking down the barriers to opportunity for every child at every stage, thus implying from the very first years of a child's life. And while this commitment is an admirable one, it is certainly not without challenge. And if we look back at the last 20 years, despite significant increases in public spending on the early years, the disadvantage gap has barely budged, attesting of the complexity of the problem. So a big challenge lies, but a necessary one to tackle if we are to ensure that all children have a fair start at reaching their potential and living a healthy, happy, and successful life. So there are, of course, multiple ways that any government can tackle this issue, and we're here today to discuss what Labour should do and the trade-offs it should consider should it win the next general election. So given the link between family income and child development, should Labour focus on lifting families out of poverty as a way of reducing the disadvantage gap? Or should public funds be spent on building strong public services for families? And if that's the case, how should these services be delivered and how should they be targeted, if at all? And of course, the financial and political context matters a lot for this discussion. And one of the key things we should keep in mind is that the Labour Party may inherit a commitment made by the current government to double what is currently being spent to expand the free entitlement. And so we may want to reflect on the extent to which the Labour Party should commit to this policy or change it to address early childhood inequalities more effectively. And to discuss these issues, we could not be in better company than with our three fantastic panelists, three women that I deeply admire and who have spent their entire careers working on these issues, and who, from their positions in and at the intersection of policy research and advocacy, have unique insights into what the answer to these questions should be. So to kick off the conversation, we've asked our three panelists to make some opening remarks around 5 minutes each focusing on three broad types of policies or issues. And first, we will hear from Alison Garnham, Chief Executive of the Child Poverty Action Group, about giving money directly to families via the welfare system. Next, we will turn to Donna Molloy. We're delighted to have you here, Deputy Chief Executive of Foundations, a relatively new What Works Center for Children and Families. And Donna will discuss support for parents. And then we will turn to Kerry Oppenheim, currently Early Childhood Lead at the Nuffield Foundation, and advisor to the Royal Foundation Centre for Early Childhood. And we've asked Kerry to discuss merits of strengthening public services for families in their local communities. And so following these opening remarks, we'll discuss some of the issues that have been raised before opening the floor for questions from you here in Liverpool, but also online. And for those of you who are attending online, you can join the conversation in the comments box and ask questions throughout the event, and my colleague Laura will share them with us. And also for those joining online, closed captions can be accessed via the LinkedIn live stream. So without further ado, I will hand over to our first panelist, Alison. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks to Leicester for inviting me. I think I'm here to make the case for why families with children need money. Fairly obvious, really, but I'm sure I'm going to be shot down in flames fairly shortly. That's the plan. So I wanted to be starting by talking about, at the moment, social policy seems to have lost heart around cash transfer. Certainly politicians of both left and right spend a lot of time talking about how poverty is going to be dealt with through the economy and jobs or through investment in public services, and don't want to say much about cash transfers, probably because it costs a lot of money. But in other spheres, people haven't lost heart at all. If you look at the development sector, for example, it's now well understood that rather than going and bossing people about, you give people cash, and it turns out they sort themselves out. They invest in their own businesses, they send their children to school, they have better diets. In this country, we still seem to be arguing about whether people should have vouchers or whether money actually works, which is obviously true that it does. Obviously, some services are essentially in order for families to make a living, but I don't think from an evidence perspective, cash has lost ground. If anything, the evidence has got stronger in recent years with the impact on long-term outcomes. And of course, what Social Security does is to smooth out people's incomes across the life cycles of birth, family formation, becoming unemployed, sick, retirement, and so on. And Professor John Hills did a great book called Good Times, Bad Times that shows how we pretty much pay in and take out pretty evenly across our life cycle. But also it's worth looking back at what's happened in the UK. We've proved in the UK that child poverty is policy responsive. We had a child poverty strategy under the last Labour government where investment in tax credits and increases in child benefit led to a fall of over 1 million children in poverty. And child well-being improved on 36 out of 48 OECD indicators. Paul Gregg and his team showed that when income was rising, families spent more on fruit, vegetables, books and children's clothes and less on alcohol and tobacco. Money works. But we've recently gone through a period which has been kind of uniquely poverty producing at a really accelerated rate. We now spend 42 billion a year less on social security than we did in 2010. And children have fared really badly. So partly some of the policies that are designed to sort of compel adult behaviour, like make people work or make people have fewer children, like the benefit cap and two-child policy, have completely failed to make any change in adult behaviour. What they have done is driven hundreds of thousands of children into poverty. There are now 600,000 more children in poverty than in 2010. 71% of them live with at least one working parent. Jobs have not protected families from poverty. When the £20 addition was made during the COVID pandemic, child poverty fell by 200,000. Again, this shows that money works. When it was taken away, it went back up again. And in the UK, there's been no UK-wide response to families with children, except for the Scottish Child Payment in Scotland, and of course the emergency school meal support during lockdown. Families with children were still being left out of packages to support the cost of living. So the £20 payment, the energy lump sums, all ignore family size. You get the same regardless of whether you've got children or not. Child benefit has lost 25% of its value since 2010, and benefits have risen by inflation in only 4 out of the last 13 years. That's where the 42 billion has gone. The freezes and failure to up rates has taken a lot of money out of the system. And we've seen the growth of food banks, so different responses to poverty. Trussell Trust were giving out 128,000 food parcels in 2011. 23, they give out 3 million, including to 1 million children. This is unprecedented in the UK. And there's also been a move away from cash, with often local authorities giving people vouchers instead of money, which are hugely problematic because it forces people to possibly even spend money on travel to supermarkets they wouldn't normally go to. And just they're really unpopular with parents. We polled parents during the pandemic. 80% wanted cash and not vouchers. So also, I think we need to take into account that the public is now much more sympathetic to social security. The latest British Social Attitudes shows public much more willing to pay higher tax in favour of supporting people more. It's really a bad idea to miss what's going on with public opinion. They know that food banks are not okay. So back to the evidence about what happens to children as a result of all of this. I mean, there's a mountain of evidence. Kitty Stewart and Keris Cooper and their team at the LSE did a meta-analysis of all the studies of child outcomes to try and find out what the causal link was between them all. There was only one causal link, it was low income. The only factor that could be shown to have a causal effect on children's outcomes was low income. And some of these studies were random controlled trials. So some people got money and other people didn't. You could show directly who did better. All of these studies together show that when there's increased income, children do better in education, better early cognitive development, higher test scores, more years of schooling, better attendance, better social, emotional, and behavioural development. Even looking at adult outcomes, where there are higher benefits in childhood, there are higher employment prospects as an adult. Also positive impacts on the adult health outcomes, including life expectancy. And the sizes of these effects are really large. So what this means, it's a really good investment. It's a highly cost-effective investment for government to make sure that families are not living in poverty. And the likely mediating factor of all of this is the stress and anxiety that parents experience as a result of managing poverty. It's really hard to parent effectively when you're in a state of panic most of the time about how you're going to survive and put food on the table. We've currently got a kind of a natural experiment going on in the UK. In Scotland, we've got the Scottish Child Payment, £25 a week that's been introduced. Excuse me, I've got the conference call. It's forecast to reduce child poverty from 24% pre-pandemic to 17% in 2023-24. England is going to be a decent counterfactual to what would have happened in Scotland without the Scottish Child Payment. We'll see the difference. And Scotland, of course, has limited tax raising powers compared to the UK. UK is in a better position to do more. Another example, actually, of the impact of income was Mary Reeder's paper on the effect of the Health in Pregnancy grant. This was introduced in 2009 and then repealed in 2011 under the coalition. It gave pregnant mothers a lump sum payment of 3 months of child benefit, £190, whilst they were pregnant, to improve their health outcomes while they were before they gave birth. And so she compared the birth outcomes of babies who were just not eligible to the policy with those who were, and then vice versa when the policy ended. She found that the policy increased birth weight by 8 to 12 grams on average. It reduced low birth weight by 3 to 6% and decreased prematurity by 9 to 11%, just giving people more cash. And life is getting more expensive for families. And we just did a study looking at the cost of school day. And if you use a minimum income standards approach, or the consensual approach, how much families say that they need to spend, for 14 years of a child's life at school, it costs families something like, this is just for the minimum educational needs of a child, £18,346. And that's because we've got free education, but it's not free. There are uniforms, there's food, there's equipment, you have to be online at home. Kids get disciplined if they haven't done their online homework. Kids get disciplined if they don't have the right uniform. It costs parents a lot of money. And it costs the country a lot of money to have so many children living in poverty. Donald Hirsch at Loughborough University calculated for us that in 2008, the total cost of child poverty was about 25 billion a year. That's the need for responses and services and benefits and the loss of tax income from people who can't work as much as they would like to. In 2023, that figure has risen from 25 billion to 39 billion a year, both due to higher prices and higher rates of child poverty. And these are cautious estimates, and we expect this figure to go beyond 40 billion. It shows, again, that a large investment in reducing child poverty would bring similarly large gains to the economy. So finally, just a few things that I think have to be done as an emergency. We're absolutely thrilled, actually, that the National Policy Forum has just decided to say that there will be a child poverty strategy again. This is fantastically good news for all of us. We don't know the detail of the contents yet, but there's a lot of goodwill around it, and we're really thrilled about it. But just some things that we think would be really essential. First of all, child benefit needs to be restored. It's lost 25% of its value. If you increased it by £20 a week, you'd see 500,000 children lifted out of poverty. If you got rid of the benefit cap, which is pushing people into very deep poverty, mostly single parents, it reduces the depth of poverty for 250,000 children and costs just 300 million, 0.1% of our social security spending. The two-child limit would lift 250,000 children out of poverty if it was abolished, and would lift a further 850,000 out of deep poverty, at a cost of just 1.3 billion. And those families miss out on £3,235 a year per child. It's a lot of money. And of course, we want to extend free school meals to all children on universal credit as a step towards universal free school meals. But again, the final thing is that we just need to invest once again in a comprehensive child poverty strategy. Biden actually, there's now a child poverty action group in Washington, DC, who've been pushing for child tax credits. And Biden introduced the child tax credit, didn't he, during the lockdown in America. US child poverty fell to 5.2%. And then rose again to 12.4% in 2022, which was the largest one-year increase on record because the policy expired. So they haven't committed to it again, but it proves once again that money works. And I think these proposals are really realistic. We've plenty of evidence from the last child poverty strategy that child poverty is policy responsive. We just need to do it again. And just one final point. I don't think we can continue to talk about children as outcomes, as becomings. They have childhoods now. They're living through deprivation now, and they deserve a decent life now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alison, and we'll come back to some of the points that you've raised, but now I'll hand over to Donna.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks very much. I've been asked to talk about the importance of supporting parenting, but would also like to acknowledge I think we would agree with a lot of what Alison has just said. Am I allowed to say that?
Yeah.
So it's difficult to overstate the importance of the role that parents play in their children's lives. Parenting and the quality of parent-child relationships is one of the most important drivers of inequalities in children's development in the early years. We know that most an excellent job at supporting their children's needs, but some parents struggle. The reasons for this are well documented: mental health problems, conflict between parents, as well as high levels of economic stress that can make it impossible for parents to meet their children's needs. And we know that as a result, gaps in children's development open up early, and these gaps can be really hard to shift. And in these cases, effective parenting and family support can make a significant difference in terms of improving children's lives. So yes, a future Labour government should invest in parenting support and parenting programmes. And the focus should be, and I can't emphasise this enough, directing the types of support that have been shown to work to those children and families who need this most. This is an area where we know a huge amount, actually, about what works. Our previous work looked at 75 forms of support or interventions in the period from conception to age 5. We found that a quarter of those had very good evidence of improving a whole range of outcomes for children. But of those remaining 3/4, many of those had not been tested at all and found to make any difference, including many things that were widely delivered in early years services. So what does work? Well, there's not time to list everything here, but just a couple of examples. The strongest evidence is for programmes with a very clear target population and rationale. One example, intensive home visiting in the period between birth and 2 years has been repeatedly shown to reduce income-related learning gaps when targeted at families with one or more risks. The best example here is Family Nurse Partnership, which people will have heard of, which has some of the best evidence about helping children achieve good levels of development at the end of reception and Key Stage 1, which is based on a 7-year follow-up study carried out here in the UK. My second point is that supporting parenting, the benefits aren't just about early learning and education. Supporting parents is also crucial in terms of children's behaviour and mental health. We know that lack of sensitive parenting and use of harsh discipline can be linked to behavioural problems, which are one of the most common types of mental health problems in early childhood, affecting 5 to 10% of young children. Without support, parents can inadvertently reinforce and encourage negative behaviours, making these more entrenched, which can then go on to lead to school failure, likelihood of children engaging in antisocial behaviour, and a whole range of other issues. Again, this is an area where we know actually quite a lot about what works. Problems can be stopped if effective support is offered to families who need it most between the ages of 2 and 3. There's very good evidence for group-based parenting support, which are relatively low-cost types of support and intervention. Example here is the Incredible Years preschool programme. Lots of other examples of effective programmes too would direct you to the Foundation's website, where lots of this information sits. But my final message is that, as well as thinking about what needs to happen, a future Labour government should also focus on how to really grip this agenda, to make sure those parents who need support are most likely to receive it. These interventions aren't new. We've known what works in this space for a very long time now, yet there's a long-standing gap between what the evidence tells us makes a difference and what is often commissioned and offered locally to children and families. We can see that research and evidence have transformed areas like healthcare, and have to ask ourselves, why aren't we thinking about effectiveness in terms of support for children and families in the same way that we are in fields such as health and education? We'd argue that a new government needs to really grip this. There are lots of lessons from the last 20 years about what to do and what not to do. I would highlight 3 things. I think this needs to be driven centrally, with funding and incentives for local areas to deliver effective support models. There needs to be support to implement some of these proven models well. We know that this can be quite difficult, and we need to ensure key levers in the system, such as inspection, reinforce use of the things that have been shown to work. I think one reflection from the last 2 decades of many policy initiatives in this space is that we often have the right ambitions or try to do the right things, but how we go about achieving these ambitions is often insufficient, and we don't stay the course. Some of the strongest examples of major attempts to scale evidence-based parenting and family support over the last 2 decades were just not sustained. So I mentioned Family Nurse Partnership. People may remember an ambition for Family Nurse Partnership to be available in every local authority in England. I think at the last estimate, there were only about a third of councils where that support was happening. Again, Incredible Years, various attempts to make this available in every local community, which just hasn't stuck. Government needs to resist the temptation to fund innovation rather than delivery of proven models. Innovation, of course, has its place, but in the area of parenting support, we don't need to reinvent wheels. A new government provides an opportunity to give serious attention to scaling up effective support for parenting. This would reduce income-related gaps in education, but also yield far wider benefits in terms of reducing pressure on the National Health Service, the criminal justice system, and so on. I think this needs a concerted push from the centre and locally as well. A new government creates a real opportunity. Let's do it properly this time.
Thank you very much, Donna. And now, Kerry.
I agree with both of the previous speakers. The challenge will be how we balance all of those things up. I think, although I will talk about public services, I do think, so the work that we've been doing at the Nuffield Foundation, which is to try and look at through the lens of early childhood as a whole, and particularly with a focus on disadvantage, is that we absolutely have to have a holistic approach to addressing those inequalities that start from birth if we're going to make a difference. And so we argue really strongly that you need to look both at income and deprivation and both the direct effects that it has on children's lives, as well as the indirect ones, which are mediated through mental health of the mother and the father and parenting. We need to look at parenting support and intervention. We need a good quality early childcare and early education, health and the home learning environment built around the child and the family. But we'll come back to that. And leaving that aside, I think the two things that we need to address is how we reduce the pressures that parents with children face and how we support the capabilities, the skills, the talents of young children growing up in those families, and keeping both of those things in mind when we're trying to think about services. The challenges when we think about both the childcare system and children's centres and families hubs is just how depleted Sure Start Children's Centres have become. And also if we look at patterns of spending in relation to the early years, and this is some of the work that Sarah Catton and others have done at the Institute for Fiscal Studies, we can see a shift away from that younger age, which, the sort of 0 to 3, and obviously in part that's a reflection of what's been going on in relation to Sure Start. And we see a very fragile early years and childcare system in terms of the sustainability and desperately in need of investment. So it's a challenging context, but I still think there are real major opportunities for reducing the disadvantage gap. And I would say we need to start to think about how we recreate a more integrated and coordinated a group of services around parents with young children under the age of 5. That is about open access, it's about targeted support, and it's also about addressing vulnerability. And of course, that is pretty similar to what Sure Start was doing or intended to do. That's not to say we can simply recreate Sure Start as it was, and there's lots and lots we can learn from the experience of delivering Sure Start. The evidence suggests that the centres that were most effective were the ones where they used evidence-based programmes, so what Donna was saying, that they worked in an interagency way, so they're bringing together different kinds of service, and the families that used it most were more likely to benefit. No big surprise there. And work again that Sarah has done and colleagues looked at the effectiveness of Sure Start, and you looked at the period when Sure Start was at its height, 2010-11, on hospitalizations of children much later on, not in their early years, but in their teenage years. And the reduction in hospitalizations is really, really significant, as well as being even more significant for children growing up in poorer areas. So while impact took some time to demonstrate itself, we can see that Sure Start was effective in many ways. So how do we, given that Sure Start children's centres have been much depleted, what do we do to create this much more integrated approach to young children? So there's something about using the existing assets that we have. So we have, albeit fragile, an early childhood, early child care and early education infrastructure. And that feels a really important sort of anchor to which we want to attach the family support services that families need and the outreach. So there's something about it's a trusted service. There is they're people with a lot of experience of delivering services, but at the moment the way in which we think about these services is very fragmented. So I think there's the potential to join up some of the work that's been done in relation to family hubs. They're they're very minimal in comparison with Sure Starts as they were, but they are doing some useful things. So how do we begin with our early childcare system, family hubs, supporting families, and start to join those things up? I would say that we need to think about particularly about prioritising children and families who are in poverty and those children with additional needs. We need to focus on the 0 to 3s in particular, and again that's been demonstrated that, you know, if we look at the spending, that group has had less spending. I think there are opportunities to look at the link between digital interventions and interventions that take place face to face, and so we might begin by thinking about the 2-year-old childcare offer, which goes to disadvantaged families. How do we bolster that? How do we add the family support that might reach out to families who are not taking it up? How do we improve the quality of that provision as a way to give those young children the best possible start? There are also interventions that are taking place within nursery settings. So the Nuffield Early Language Intervention, which actually takes place at reception age, is geared towards improving young children's language and communication skills. It has shown to be really effective for all children, but particularly effective for disadvantaged children, enabling them to catch up by up to 7 months in terms of language delay. And they're just about to, we have had a pilot in the nursery sector for a similar kind of intervention, but adapted for younger children. And that's going to be scaled. They're going to test and scale it up to see if it's effective. So there are definitely things that we can do, but I think we need to think about how we bring together services that are addressing child poverty, so all the things that Alison was talking about, as well as parenting interventions in the context of what is the sort of service that families and children are accessing. How do we facilitate the conversations that need to happen between the midwife, the early years worker, the health visitor? That happens in many local areas. There's some brilliant experiments going on, but what does it mean to try to build that infrastructure from the point at which we are right now, where there's, you know, real pressure on public spending? But I still think plenty of sort of anchors on which to add those integrated services.
Thank you very much, Kerry and Alison and Donna, for these very rich reflections. So perhaps we can kick off the conversation just by going back to some of the points raised by Alison on the importance of income. Alison, you seem to say that there's already a lot of evidence out there to show that giving more money to poor families is a good way to improve their children's development. Now, I'd like to ask you then, what do you think is missing, or what, as a community of researchers, innovators, advocates, we can do to actually make sure that we act on this evidence, and what are going to be the challenges, I think, for Labour to really act on this evidence, and how could it circumvent them?
So I think my major point is that I think we know what to do because we've done it before. It's perhaps not lack of evidence, although more evidence is always helpful. It's political will. I mean, we've landed in the position we are because of political choices. So we need to get out of it through another series of political choices. And so, I mean, that's about, I mean, we know that the economy is going to be difficult for any incoming government, and some of the things that we want are not going to happen as quickly as we want them to. We just need these things to be on the agenda. So I think, you know, everybody needs to lend their voice to that. It's no good talking about just services and not addressing the need for family incomes, because so many of these stresses that are being addressed through services are caused by the fact that families are struggling for lack of income. It's as simple as that. So you need to actually solve the problem. They're poor because they don't have enough money. So yeah, but I mean, I agree with everybody else as well. You know, I mean, the mass child poverty strategy wasn't just about money. It was also about Sure Start. We had the first childcare strategy. We had the national minimum wage. We had employment support for parents. You know, lots of these things were going on in tandem. One of the things that really was effective, I think, was that every child matters. When you talk to people in the sector and you mention it, they go, oh, God, yeah, I remember that. But it was really effective because you had schools, social workers, local authorities, everybody with a similar set of objectives. Their objectives were around reducing child poverty, helping parents to work, improving children's outcomes. And so they all recognised each other. They all knew they were working from the same sort of, same list of objectives. So that would be something really worth bringing back.
Gary, I was just wondering if you wanted to reflect a little bit, especially given your work at the Royal Foundation around raising public awareness about the importance of early childhood, and whether there is some work there to be done to also sort of bolster the political will.
Yes, I guess the work at the Royal Foundation is very focused on how do we get a sort of campaign to raise awareness that this phase of life is very important, and that there are things that you can do that can make a difference, and there's a big focus on social and emotional development, on children and parents' mental well-being. And I think when we think about the disadvantage gap, we often focus sort of primarily on what might be sort of more narrowly kind of termed, cognitive skills and academic skills. And of course, they're really, really important. But how do we, that somebody's very desperate to come in, I just finished my sentence. How do we, but we know, and Donna, you were also saying this, that the sort of behavioural, social, emotional development and parents, mothers in particular, so well-being are really important in terms of shaping those outcomes. And so it's just that we need to think about child development in the round. So I think the Royal Foundation can play a really important role in reaching out to and get those wider messages, because it needs to be not only of interest to people who have a young child or have some contact with a young child, but to society as a whole. And there's just this, it's not that I don't think that this is the only window in which you can make a difference. I'm passionately supportive about how we address inequalities from this very early stage. But we know, and again, the work that Sarah has done is that you need to keep making a difference afterwards. But this gap is there, and it's present so clearly. With big gaps in terms of socioeconomic disadvantage and other gaps kind of playing into that we have to be able to do something differently. And I think we can only do it if we have a holistic approach, because clearly you can see that all these things interact with each other. And if you look at what's going on in central government, it's incredibly fragmented. It's really difficult to get Department of Work and Pensions to come to the table if you're talking about early years services. Definitely. And so maybe the things you describe, Alison, in terms of some of the changes that happened with the social security system, it's also much more discretionary, isn't it?
Yes.
So that means you have to be in the know to go and access. Hopefully, a payment, or you need much better tech. We could help with some of that in terms of the technology, in terms of data, to get to those people who need it. But the sort of poverty conversation is not really part of the early years childcare conversation, and Labour has an opportunity to make that possible. And I think there's also, sorry, I'm now stop. There's also an issue, I think, about a reluctance to go back to Sure Start. So great affection for Sure Start, but a reluctance, and that's obviously partly because there's a big pound sign attached to that, and because some things worked in Sure Start and some things didn't work in Sure Start. And it's also the difficulty of being able to show impact immediately. That was trying to create a new institution, a new part of the welfare state, and that takes time. And so you get results which, when was your research published, Sarah, on Sure Start and hospitalised? So 2 years ago, long after Sure Start was at its height. So there's something about how government works and how you are patient enough to give things a go and to make mistakes and try things and not abandon them, which feels really important as we, as people start to plan what to do next.
If I can just say before I direct other questions, but just on this point around the evaluating, and it may take a long time before you start seeing results and you're able to measure them. It's also worth noting that I think some programs are not set up so that they can be evaluated relatively quickly, and Sure Start was one of them, really. Like, I think it was very And so there could be ways now that if we are thinking about introducing your program or shifting a little bit the way that some programs are delivered, that we can really take, I think, evaluation more in consideration when even implementing them. I know that some people would like to come in. Oh, wow, a lot of questions. Okay, so let's just open the floor for question. If you could introduce yourself and the organization you're from before asking the question. Yeah. Oh, sorry, the microphone. Yeah.
Sorry. Hi, I'm Stephen Kingdom. I'm the campaign manager of the Disabled Children's Partnership, which is a coalition of more than 100 charities that campaign on better support for disabled children and their families. And the Child Poverty Action Group is one of our charities. We know that disabled children are more likely to be growing up in poverty. We know their families face higher costs. Their parents are more likely to see their relationships break down. They find it harder to access childcare. Let alone the specialist services that are increasingly difficult for them to get. So my question is a simple one. What should the new Labour government be doing to eradicate the disadvantage gap as it's felt and experienced by disabled children and their families?
Should we take a couple? Okay, I think the lady in the back. Okay.
I'm Eileen Driver from Richmond CLP. I was an English teacher for hundreds of years, and I did a visiting fellowship and an A-level examiner, and I had a visiting fellowship at Cambridge to do some literature research and liaising with the university to get more state school students into Cambridge. But most of all, I'm a grandmother and a parent, a mother, and observing the unnecessary, I've mentioned all the academic stuff because I'm crazy about academic learning, but to observe the formality in the 4 to 6 year olds. And what would we all in this room say to the summer-born 4-year-old who's given this incredibly formal school day and compared, and then at the end of the, I know there's many more factors involved than just the the curriculum at the moment in 4 to 6 year old learning in our schools, but compared to the Scandinavian children who have much more play-centered nursery education within those 2 crucial years, and they have excellent childcare provided, so it's not going to deprive parents of the childcare. And at 17, the British child is likely to have less good results academically than the Scandinavian child. Within the Scandinavian system, and the places that it's much more development of the child's resilience, the child's creativity, all of which are shrinking in British schools at the moment. And also how many of these other problems for deprived families could be dealt with if we had those 2 years, not only giving children a happy childhood. One last quick point. I had to pick up my 5.5 summer-born, because the summer-born children it's worse for, and research showing how some of them go off reading but when they've learnt it quickly. I had to pick him up aged 5.5, and they do that baseline test at which he achieved a lot when he first went in. And because of it, the teacher said to me, giving me an A4 piece of paper, and she said, look, we have to do half an hour silent writing, and he only did 15 minutes today. So can you get him to retell the story of St. George and the Dragon? Can you get, I'm sure this isn't just one school, I think it was because of what he was at. Can you get him to punctuate it and use vocabulary beyond his age group? And I don't think she knew I'd been a teacher. I'm forbidden by my children to talk to the teachers about my strong feeling on things. And so as a character building thing, I had to take it. And that's an extreme example probably, but it's unnecessary, stultifying. I hope what do the panel think about a more Scandinavian form of education to remedy and enrich our children?
Thank you. Okay, maybe we'll take one more question and then have the panel.
Nani Shimadi, Camden Councillor, also the diversity lead. First of all, let me start by agreeing with everything that the panelists said. However, I think a huge thing was missed, race, because when we talk about the disadvantage gap, the ones that are most affected are ethnic minorities, and they not only And I think, yeah, for that not to be mentioned, because it's different layers. It's when you spoke about stress. So imagine being poor and having to deal with racial issues. You know, I've got 2 young children in primary school, and how I parent, say, my young black boy, on top of all the other pressures in a white society, is added pressures. And I feel that needed to be addressed as well. And even in the terms of decision making, having just even like an all-white panel, or at that level, sometimes it can be a class thing and a race thing, that if it's all white or all educated or all middle class, so many things can be missed that you won't pick up. That's about social aspects, you know, that added pressure. So that really needs to be addressed. Thank you.
Thank you for this question. So we had a first question about gaps between disabled and non-disabled children. Another question around the sort of academization of the early years, how structured the system is. And first, I think that links with some of the points made earlier around the importance of thinking about well-being and not just academics in the early years. And lastly, a very important point around racial inequalities and perhaps the intersectionality of socioeconomic and race. So I'm sure all of you have quite a lot to say. Donna, could I ask you to perhaps start, and Kerry and Alison?
So just a couple of comments on the last 2 questions. Firstly, on the point about the narrow curriculum, there are lots of debates about what the right focus there is that I wouldn't comment on, but just to say from an evidence perspective, we've previously, Kerry and I, done lots of work looking at the evidence for teaching social and emotional skills in schools. And that is one of the sort of best evidenced ways to develop mental health, well-being, and a whole range of sort of protective factors in terms of children's well-being. Again, these interventions are well evidenced. We know what works in this space, but we often just don't do it. So would support a lot of what you've said.
Yes, I won't add to what Donna said in relation to, first of all, starting with disability. It's absolutely right, of course, of what you say in relation to disabled children and parents who have a disability as well, being at a much higher risk of poverty. And that's a really major issue that needs to be addressed. It's also much harder to access early years provision for children with a special educational need or a disability, and yet the need for support and help and and stimulating play and all of those things is even more important. So it needs to be a really key feature and something that should be included as part of Labour's planning. In relation to race and disadvantage, absolutely right. Again, much greater risks for some ethnic minority groups in terms of poverty, particularly early childhood poverty. And you're right to say that actually it's the interplay also between race, class, gender, and understanding how we make sure that we both have a workforce that is responsive and able to support children from all different kinds of backgrounds, as well as that, in terms of thinking about the sort of the overall strategy. And again, the work that Sarah, the work that you did on childhood inequalities has some really useful data about differences between groups and level, also how you might support different groups. So that's a point very well made.
Yeah, just following on from that, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, the risk of child poverty is much higher in certain communities, particularly racialized communities. Pakistani, Bangladeshi children are more than 50% likely to be in poverty, over 40% for Black African, Black Caribbean children. So the risk of poverty is incredibly high for those communities. So any child poverty strategy would have to have a strand particularly dealing with that. I don't think it did last time, and it definitely does. And one of the things I think that's about is, I mean, Kerry was talking about how you embed these things. One of the things that didn't happen last time with the child poverty strategy was there wasn't public buy-in. The government didn't do enough to explain to the public what they were doing. It was all being done by stealth, and then it all managed to disappear and nobody noticed it. You can't do that again. People need to know what's going on, and you need to engage the experts by experience. You need to talk to the communities in the design of the strategy and in the design of the responses. I think that's absolutely crucial, and because it was missed, people didn't understand what was happening and weren't engaged with it. And that's something that the new strategy has to tackle. On the disability point, I don't know where to start on this one. I have a 19-year-old son with severe autism, and I was just telling somebody yesterday about experience trying to get him into a nursery. I mean, they just lied to us, you know, oh, we haven't got enough staff at the moment. And it was only later we realised, actually, that was disability discrimination. They just didn't want him because he had the disability, and they were going to have to get another member of staff. You know, so we were going from place to place, not understanding. The longer you go on, the more you realise how little resource there is for all this kind of thing. Newly qualified teachers have had no training in special needs. They don't know how to deal with it, even though the government wanted schools, you know, for children with disabilities to be educated in schools. They have no training to deal with it. Speech and language therapists are like a revolving door. They stay for 6 months and then disappear. So much more investment is needed in this area. It feels to me like we're at the start of it. The Autism Act and so on helped with that. But for all disabled children, childcare is a huge issue. It's more expensive and it just doesn't exist. It's impossible to find. I think Emma and I, when we were at Daycare Trust, the big childcare gaps were for older children, children with disabilities, and for parents working atypical hours, and they're still the same. They're still the main gaps in childcare. You can't, for love nor money, at an SEN school, get extended schools. There's no after-school clubs. There's no additional support around the school day like there is in mainstream schools. So, you know, this is an area that needs some proper attention.
Thank you. Yes, at the front.
Hello, I'm Councillor Gail Barton from Burnley. We have a massive disadvantage gap in our area. I'm very proud to also be a trustee for our local Home Start scheme for across East Lancashire. Now, we have found our casework, I suppose, has gone from our core mission of just being there to give parents a helping hand, just help them find their feet, to essentially taking on statutory work that the local authority can't cope with, which is not a great situation for volunteers to find themselves in. Given the proposals that you've kind of outlined, what we need to see, where do you see charities' place in that, given the funding pressures that we have? Is there going to be an expectation that charities will be filling the gaps, or do they need to be local authority, public sector providers actually doing this work?
Thank you, Chair. I'm James White, Secretary of the Socialist Education Association. I just wanted to raise 2 points. The first one, I think it's a bit of an elephant in the room that hasn't been mentioned, which is housing. We've got, I think, 170,000 children living in temporary accommodation. And that is such a disadvantage if when people are going to school and getting themselves organised for the day and all those kind of issues. And even money, I think, although I totally support Child Poverty Action Group saying without the housing, even the cash isn't going to resolve that. We've seen in London, where I'm from, where, you know, and now the housing crisis is driving people out of the city, schools are closing. And the second point is, I think, is about Labour's attitude at the moment. I get the picture that childcare for them at the moment is mainly about, in inverted commas, the big growth drive, not about the quality of the care and education that is received by the child. I mean, I think that's behind, sadly, I think it's, I'm all in favour of the free school meals initiative, but the Breakfast Club initiative is around finding that wraparound care, so to get people into work and rather than finding the quality of education for the child. Now, I thought it's really hard. Children don't have a vote, unfortunately, but I think we've got to keep pressing on that quality of service for early years, whether that's in schools, as you say, or the wraparound school services.
I think I see there are lots of questions, but I'm also mindful of time. So maybe a quick one, and then we'll let our panelists answer.
Oh, thank you so much. Hi, I'm Janine Hyatt. I'm from the Fair Education Alliance. We're a coalition tackling educational inequality. Really proud to have CPAC as members. My question is, there's a really good discussion about how we can support families to create great home learning environments. And we know that can be really impactful, but also that supply of more formal childcare settings is really poor in low-income neighborhoods. So just wondering, is there a solution that we see to that? We've proposed increasing the pupil premium, but are there other creative solutions that you have come across, including bolstering the workforce of childminders?
Great, thank you very much. So three very interesting questions. One around the role of charities in delivering this sort of overall strategy. Two around housing, and perhaps how much does that overlap with some of the points that Alison made? How differently should we think about housing? And lastly, about childcare. As currently, I would agree, is very much thought about as a drive for growth in increasing maternal employment, as opposed to really thinking about children and hence implications for the quality of childcare, which was around the last question. So Alison, perhaps this time I'll ask you to go first.
Yeah, so I think we spent another half an hour in here. We probably saw everything out. We've got lots of really great expertise around the room, obviously. In terms of charities, filling the gaps. I mean, at local level, when I worked in local charities, I felt very strongly that charities' role was to identify gaps and to move into the areas that weren't being tackled by government policy. And actually, in many ways, success is when you've demonstrated that need and it becomes publicly funded service in the end. But of course, there's so many gaps remaining. There's no shortage of things to do, is there? And we've just lived through a period where the charity sector has moved in. Food banks is the classic example, isn't it? So the gaps just left by government policy, and it's been troopers moving in and doing something because you have to, but they shouldn't be there. It shouldn't be needed at all. So I think we're all in the business of thinking that some charitable efforts really need to go. There shouldn't be a need for them. On housing, you're absolutely right. I mean, the child poverty strategy that I was talking about is one that goes right across government. So obviously housing is one of those things. And one of the things driving child homelessness at the moment is, of course, the freezing of the local housing allowance, because in universal credit, you get like a total contribution towards your rent. You don't get your actual rent. Somehow you've got to find the rest of the money from somewhere else. And it's really driving higher levels of homelessness. So yeah, that's definitely something that has to be addressed. And all the other stuff about quality of childcare that people were raising, quality in low-income neighbourhoods. I mean, we're back to the whole thing about how you create high-quality childcare, and it's only high-quality childcare that delivers improved outcomes for children. And that's been the knowledge for the childcare strategy ever since it started back in the early 2000s. And one of the things Sure Start did was to bring childcare into deprived neighbourhoods. That was one of the point, but unfortunately it was later decided that it wasn't necessary for Sure Start to actually have childcare in it, which is a massive shame, because there can be childcare deserts essentially, because you don't get the cross subsidy that you get in more middle class areas in childcare. And I think there's a massive case for just expanding the maintained sector, to be honest with you. That's where the quality lies. That's where the economies of scale lie, where you've got professional leaders with graduate qualifications. That's what quality is. Get on with it.
I just wanted to offer a comment on who's best placed to deliver this. I think it definitely doesn't need to be all local authority delivered. Some voluntary sector organisations are far better placed to establish strong relationships in communities. We know that effective support is all based on the quality of the relationship between the person providing the support and the child and family. What's crucial is that those providing parenting and family support are properly trained, supervised and supported. We shouldn't be using untrained volunteers as a way of trying to do this on the cheap. We know skill really matters. And just a comment, the lady from Camden who mentioned race, just to say the most important thing is thinking about sort of culturally appropriate provision. We know in terms of parenting support, certainly one size doesn't fit all, and the things that are most effective are very carefully designed with a target group and clear rationale for the type of support being provided. And certainly organisations like the Race Equality Foundation are sort of pioneering the way in terms of models of parenting support for different groups and communities, and we need to do much more of that.
Maybe I'll just pick up the sort of childcare point about the kind of balance between employment and growth. And clearly that, you know, we need childcare to do both. It needs to both provide a stimulating environment for children to develop and flourish. And we also need to help people get into work, because clearly they need to go into work in order to be able to reduce poverty. So we need both, but it's clear that the government's plans are much more employment focused, and there's been a strong emphasis also in Labour's discussions also about the importance of childcare as being a kind of means to getting growth and improving employment. So we do need to hold the early years development side. That, you know, the focus is in today's conversation is about disadvantaged gaps, and just thinking about how we can do that effectively. And the kind of workforce, which also came up separately, is really vital in this. And just thinking, and there have been really helpful kind of indications from Labour about a long-term strategy for improving the workforce and giving them the opportunities, the pay and the conditions to stay in this field. So it does feel to me extraordinary that we think that somehow care for the under fives is a much kind of lesser task than it is for you know, when you start at 5. And Ravi, you're thinking about, I remember you saying to me, why are we not worried about this gap that happens at the age of 5 in the way that we're worried about young people who are not in education, employment or training, which has, I mean, lots of issues to do about that as well. But that has a sort of resonance. People understand that there's something really wrong there. And when it comes to young children, there isn't the same, it's back to your point about campaigning, there isn't the same understanding of why this really matters. And so I think the workforce, getting the workforce right, and the sense of the value and importance of the task and progression opportunities and the right training and support. We did at Nuffield, we funded some work on early years education in universities, and it's incredibly patchy and the quality isn't great. So we really need to take a kind of whole look at this, but it's not something obviously that you're going to kind of solve overnight.
Thank you very much. So I'm afraid we're out of time, but please join me in thanking our panelists. Rich conversation. So thank you very much.